Welcome. My name is Cindy Kunis with the Delaware River Greenway Partnership. We promote, protect, and preserve the Delaware River. About once a month, we hold a heritage lecture on various topics pertaining to the Delaware River and the region. If you miss a lecture, you can find it at our YouTube channel at Delaware River GP. I'd like to introduce you to today's program, Lichen Biodiversity in the Delaware Valley, presented by Dennis Waters. Dennis Waters is a scientist, author, and retired internet entrepreneur who has been studying the Lichen flora of the Mid-Atlantic region for 15 years. He is currently a visiting scientist at Rutgers University. His book, Behavior and Culture in One Dimension, Sequences, Affordances, and the Evolution of the Complexity, was published in 2022. If you have any questions during the program, please put them in Q&A and will be taken at the end. Take it away, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Cindy, and hello, everyone. Glad you're here tonight. Glad I'm here tonight. And I did want to mention one thing, since this is being recorded, that there will be, in the course of this, some data that has not yet been published in a peer-reviewed journal. So I would appreciate it if no one would try to cite this program in any sort of article or anything until it all gets out into the academic domain. Thank you. In any event, this evening I'm going to talk a bit about the lichens that inhabit what I'm going to call the central Delaware Valley, which covers the region, don't need to get too specific here, between Philadelphia to the south and maybe the Delaware Water Gap to the north. This is somewhat of a definition of convenience because we don't have that much data on lichens from the other parts of the Delaware Valley. The focus will be on lichens that have been documented in this century in the counties of Hunterdon, Mercer, and Burlington on the New Jersey side, and Bucks on the Pennsylvania side. Some of this work was done 15 to 20 years ago, but most within the past 9 years. The results for Mercer County and Hunterdon County are based on multi-year countywide surveys. For Bucks and Burlington, only certain areas were studied, but it's reasonable to assume that they are representative of their respective counties as a whole. One good thing about this 4-county geographic scope is that it encompasses 3 of the most important geologic provinces in our area: the coastal plain in Burlington and Mercer, the Newark Basin Piedmont in Mercer, Hunterdon, and Bucks, and the Redding Prong Highlands in Hunterdon and Bucks. As we'll discuss later, lichens resemble other living beings in that they have preferences about the climate and geology of where they live. Quick review on the geology. The coastal plain is young land, no more than 90 million years old, and in some cases as new as 10 million years. It's flat, much of the soil is sandy. Beyond the shoreline, once you leave dry land, the coastal plain is known as the continental shelf. The southern half of New Jersey is all coastal plain, but it only edges into Pennsylvania a little bit right along the Delaware River. The Piedmont is higher and rockier than the coastal plain, and in our area is mostly taken up by what's called the Newark Basin, which is this green blob you see here, mostly made of sedimentary rocks that were laid down in the Triassic and Jurassic periods from 240 to 140 million years ago, when North America and Africa started to pull away from each other. Those red and gray shales that you see all over the place in this area, those are the typical rocks of the Piedmont. In a few places, the Piedmont is interrupted by steep intrusions of diabase, commonly called trap rock, that form things like Baldpate, Sourland, and Cushatunk Mountains in New Jersey, and Bowman's Hill and Jericho Mountain in Pennsylvania. You can see on the topography here some of these intrusions. This is probably Jericho here. This is a Baldpate over in Mercer County. And finally, We have what in New Jersey are called the highlands, but are part of the larger Reading prong that stretches into Pennsylvania as far as, well, Reading. These are very old metamorphic rocks of 900 million to 1.2 billion years of age, mostly granite and gneiss. This is rugged topography with ridges separated by steep, narrow valleys. As you might expect, the very different geologies and topographies in these three provinces lead to very different lichen communities, and that is part of what gives our area its great diversity of lichens. Despite the presence of great botanists and botanical institutions like the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philly and the New York Botanical Garden, not to mention the many universities, museums, and government agencies in our area, until recently, the lichens of the central Delaware Valley had not been systematically studied. So we don't have a lot of historical data to compare. This map shows the state of affairs in New Jersey as of a few years ago. We're looking at the number of lichen specimens from each county that can be found across all of the major lichen herbaria in North America. As you can see, only the counties of Burlington here and Sussex up here um, contribute more than 1,000 specimens. The Burlington results were the result of the work of James Lendemer in Wharton State Forest. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And the Mercer County results here are also due to our work, which will also be discussed soon. So for many counties in New Jersey, still very little is known about the lichen flora. If you look at these counties that are close to New York City, Middlesex, Union, Essex, you're looking at somewhere less than 50 lichen specimens have been collected there. The only lichenologist based in our area was this guy here, William L. Dix. He was a retired high school principal who taught in Trenton and lived in Morrisville and was affiliated with the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. His collections from the 1930s and 1940s give us the only baseline we have to work with. The only drawback to Dix's work, and it's a big one, was that he primarily studied only one group of lichens, the cladonias, which we'll talk about later. His most famous paper was a survey of this group in PA, published in 1942. At this point, it would be good to introduce my collaborators in this work. On the left is Dr. James Lendemer, who was previously affiliated with both the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia and the New York Botanical Garden, and was recently appointed as New York State botanist and curator of botany at the New York State Museum. On the right is Dr. Lena Struve, professor of botany at Rutgers University and director of the Chrysler Herbarium. At the time that James and I began working together in 2016, there was no current published checklist of the lichens of New Jersey. The previous one had been published in the 19th century. There still is not one for Pennsylvania, by the way. So James and I combed through hundreds of publications and herbarium specimens to put together a checklist that was published in 2019. It listed a total of 479 lichen species in the state of New Jersey. Prior to that checklist, James had published 2 lichen surveys for our region, one for Wharton State Forest in Burlington County, and one for Nakamixon State Park in northern Bucks. Since then, we've published surveys of Mercer County, including all Mercer County parks and the preserves of the DNR Greenway Land Trust. There was also a survey of the Abbott Marshland south of Trenton, which includes some of Mercer and some of Burlington. Our subsequent work in the Hunterdon County encompassed county parks, state wildlife management areas, and preserves of the New Jersey Conservation Foundation and Hunterdon Land Trust. That work has not been published yet, but we do have a paper that's ready to submit. In Bucks County, in addition to James's work at Nakamixon, we have published lichen surveys of Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve, 5 Mile Woods, and the Honey Hollow Preserve of the Bucks County Audubon Society. So that's the work that we'll be reviewing Not in great detail tonight, but I hope to give you at least a bit of an overview of what we've managed to find. So in the course of this work, we collected almost 5,000 specimens, which will be available for future study at the Academy of Natural Sciences and the New York Botanical Garden. These are the collecting sites across the 4 counties. As you can see, the geographical coverage in Mercer and in Hunterdon is fairly extensive, as is southern Burlington. The Buck's work was at more specific isolated sites. So why are we doing this? One reason is to let the lichens speak to us about our world. Lichens have proven to be very good indicators of environmental health, and by establishing a baseline, we'll have the opportunity in the future to see how changes in air quality, temperature, and habitat disturbance affect lichen populations. We know already that a lot of lichens are exquisitely sensitive to sulfur dioxide pollution. Many species that were common here in the 19th century are simply gone, extirpated, and other species that are more robust in the face of bad air and habitat disturbance have taken over. For example, one of the most beautiful and charismatic lichens, the lungwort Loberia pulmonaria, was common throughout the mid-Atlantic before the 20th century. Now you have to travel up to undisturbed woods in New England to see it. It hasn't been seen in our area for more than 100 years. In the meantime, the mealy rosette lichen, Physia milligrana, is incredibly pollution and disturbance tolerant and will grow on almost any surface. It's perhaps the most common lichen in our area, found on street trees in our cities and a variety of man-made substrates. It's unusual in the number of places it will grow. James Lendemer provided me with this slide, which shows the diversity of lichen species found within the boundaries of New York City, which is one of the few places in North America where we have a long historical baseline. Abraham Halsey's 1823 herbarium, which was recently rediscovered by James, contains 191 species. By the time of George Wood's 1914 survey, 90 years later, that number had dropped to 51. And by the time of Ernie Brodo's survey of Long Island in 1968, the number was down to 6. 2 years later, Congress passed and President Nixon signed important amendments to the Clean Air Act that began the process of vastly improving the air quality in the region. By the time James and his graduate student Jessica Allen resurveyed New York City lichens in 2017, the number of species had rebounded to 106. So you get the sense here that lichens are sending us a very important message about the quality of our environment. In addition to enjoying clean air, most lichens are somewhat particular about the kinds of surfaces they will call home. Some lichens will only grow on bark, some only on rock, some only on soil, and some only on bare wood. Since the coastal plain does not have many rocks, most rock-dwelling lichens are simply not found there. Of the lichens that do prefer rocks, some like rocks that are more acidic, like granite or diabase, while others like less acidic rocks, such as shales and mudstones. This is why some species prefer the Piedmont to the highlands. Still other lichens prefer carbonate rocks like limestone and dolomite, or their man-made equivalents like concrete. Except for the concrete, there's not that much carbonate rock in our area. Before we go too much further, it might be useful to review what a lichen is. Most naturalists who know anything about lichens know 2 basic things. First, that a lichen is a symbiosis between an alga and a fungus, and second, that there are 3 growth forms, foliose, fruticose, and crustose. These are good things to know, even if they are not completely correct. First, a lichen is a symbiosis for sure, and the primary symbiosis is between a fungus and some photosynthetic thing, in most cases some kind of algae. But there's a lot more going on that seems to be involve various strains of bacteria as well as yeasts. A number of recent discoveries like this This is a list here of the various bacterial groups that have been found growing within lichens. They hint that a lichen is not really so much of a duet as it is perhaps a quartet or a quintet, but we don't understand how all of the pieces form a coherent whole. I should also mention that even the word lichen itself is somewhat frowned upon these days. The preferred term now is lichenized fungus, which serves to remind us that the lichen symbiosis is an evolved lifestyle for many kinds of fungi. Worldwide, about 20,000 different species of fungus have joined into a symbiotic arrangement with a photosynthetic partner. That's 20,000 species. That's somewhere between 10 and 20% of all of the fungal species that have been described. So lichenization is by no means an outlier. Rather, it's a perfectly normal way of making a living for many groups of fungi. Second, just as there are more than two things in the symbiosis, so there are more than the three standard growth forms of crustose, foliose, and fruticose. These forms describe the relationship between the lichen and its substrate, which is the surface that it grows on. Crustose lichens have no lower surface as such and are tightly and uniformly attached to their substrates, looking like they were spray painted on. If you wish to collect one of these, you take a bit of the substrate with it. Foliose lichens are more leaf-like, with a definite lower surface that attaches to the substrate only at certain points. And while crustose and foliose lichens are mostly flat, fruticose lichens grow into the third dimension and can be bushy or shrubby. In our never-ending quest for precision, lichenologists now recognize about 6 or 7 growth forms in addition to these, but I won't get into those now. We'll meet a few of them in due course. So worldwide, there are about 20,000 species of lichenized fungi. In North America, the number's about 6,000, and in New Jersey, it's almost 500, according to the checklist we published in 2019, although it's getting closer to 600 with the work that we've done since that time. Across the central Delaware Valley, in the work that we're talking about tonight, we have recorded 320 species or subspecies of lichen. County by county, we chronicled 224 species in Burlington, 174 in Mercer, 271 in Hunterdon, and 131 in Bucks. A little background on these numbers and the relationships here. The Burlington County lichens, the 224 here, were mostly collected in Wharton State Forest and represent the New Jersey pine barrens. It's quite possible that in the northern part of Burlington there are even more species than that. Hunterdon is the winner here in terms of total diversity, and that is really because Hunterdon County has enormous amounts of preserved open space and also has the highlands, which have a lichen flora that's quite distinctive from the Piedmont. Bucks County almost certainly has more than 131 lichen species, but again, we only sampled a few specific sites there, so we don't have a full census for the county. So of these, we have recorded many species that are new records for New Jersey, as well as a few that are new records for North America, and a couple that are new to science. And we'll take a look at some of those in a few minutes. But first, it would be good to look at half a dozen of the most diverse groups within our region. These are the genera with the greatest number of species. And we'll start with the most diverse, which is the Cladonia group, with 23 species in our region. This is the group that William Dick studied here almost 100 years ago. And when you want to find a Cladonia, you generally look down because they like to either live on the ground or on a rotting log lying on the ground. So if you want to study Cladonias, you should expect to spend a lot of time on your hands and knees. These lichens are commonly three-dimensional, aka fruticose, with these finger-like things called podetia pointing up. The common exception to this is our local reindeer lichen, Cladonia subtenuis, in which the podia are branched and form these ball-like structures. This is a very common lichen on the sandy soils of the New Jersey pine barrens. Also in this group is Cladonia cristatella, commonly known as the British soldier lichen because of its distinctive red cap. It likes to grow on rotting logs and old fence rails. This one here, Cladonia ochrochlora, is perhaps the most common member of this group in the region, with these powdery pointed podia. And finally, we have Cladonia grayi, which often grows in moss on the ground and forms these cute little goblets. The next common group are the Lichenoras, with 14 species in our region. These lichens are crustose, and in our area are almost always found growing on bark. They have these distinctive looking fruiting bodies, which have rims the same color as the rest of the lichen, thus their common name of rim lichens. This one over here, Lechinora strobilina, is far and away the most common and pollution and disturbance tolerant of this group. It can be found all over tree trunks and twigs in urban and suburban areas. Lechinora hypocarpa is also common. Look for it on street trees planted in parking lots at shopping centers and office parks. This has the most classic Lechinora look with these fruiting bodies, a reddish toward the middle with the whitish rim. Now, sometimes the fruiting bodies have a thin layer of powder that gives them a frosty appearance. So if you see a lichen like that in our area, it is almost certainly this one, Lechinora subpallens. Finally, there's a whole group of Lechinoras that rarely produce fruiting bodies and commonly look just like a powdery crust. Many of these can only be told apart by studying their chemistry, but this one, Lechinora thyssinophora, has this distinctive fibrous edge. It likes humidity and can commonly be found along stream channels and floodplains. The next group, Lipraria, has 13 species in our region. These are the dust lichens. I mean that, literally the dust lichens. They are broadly crustose, but a subtype of crustose called leprose. This is because the entire lichen is composed of little granules containing a bit of fungus and a bit of alga, often tied together by filaments. You often see them forming blue-green patches on trees. So if you see a lichen that is blue-green and up close looks like just a bunch of little granules, it's probably a Lipraria. They're difficult to tell apart based on appearance alone. They usually require some chemical analysis, so I won't bore you with the detailed differences. This one over here, Lipraria finkii, is the most common species in our area, probably because it will grow on bark, rock, or soil. It's named for Bruce Fink, one of the great American lichenologists from 100 years ago. Also common on trees is Lipraria caesiella, which is usually a bit bluer than the other species. This one, Lipraria normandinoides, is a species that grows on rock. And Lipraria neglecta here is fairly uncommon, can be found on rock or bark. The next group we have here is Parmotrema, the ruffle lichens. If there are any lichens in this presentation that you have probably noticed as you wander in the woods and the fields, it's probably a Parmotrema. 9 species in our area. These are very conspicuous foliose lichens. You'll find them growing on tree trunks, branches, and twigs. And they look roughly because their wide lobes grow up and away from the substrate rather than staying completely flat. The most common in our area is Parmotrema hypotropum. Second most common is Parmotrema reticulatum. Most of the species in the group can only be determined by looking at some of their anatomical characters with a magnifying lens. One exception is this one here, Parmotrema perforatum, which is the only member of the group in our area that customarily produces fruiting bodies. So you can see the fruiting bodies here, and the name perforatum comes from the holes, the perforations that form in the fruiting bodies. Next, we have Physia, also with 9 species in our area. This group is known as the rosette lichens because they tend to form little rosettes on the surface on which they grow. They are foliose, but are smaller and have much narrower lobes than the ruffle lichens that we just saw. And they also tend to cling very tightly to their substrates. It is also not unusual for them to have fruiting bodies. Earlier, I mentioned this one, Physia miligrana, as one of the most successful and cosmopolitan lichens in our region. It is most commonly found on bark, but can also colonize a variety of man-made substrates, including metal, paint, and fabric. Physia thomsoniana is a member of this group that grows exclusively on rock. Now, these two, Physia stellaris and Physia pumilior, are impossible to tell apart based on physical characters. And they also dwell in the same habitat, which is on branches and twigs up in the forest canopy. The only time you'll encounter these lichens is on branches and twigs that have fallen to the ground. The only difference between the two is that pumilior contains a single chemical that stellaris does not, which leads some, including me, to wonder whether they really are two separate species or just two variations on the same. And then finally, we have Caloplaca, fire dot lichens, with 8 species in the central Delaware Valley. These mostly grow on rock, but if you don't have much rock where you live, some of them are equally happy to grow on concrete. And you see the one thing they seem to have in common is color, all shades of orange or yellow. The first two, Caloplaca ferocissima and Caloplaca flavovirescens, are the most common, found on sidewalks and other concrete surfaces. These fruiting bodies on these two are tiny and can barely be seen with the naked eye. Usually you'll just see a yellow or orange smudge on a concrete surface, and only when you look closely will you see the fruiting bodies. This one, Caloplaca flavocitrina, doesn't produce fruiting bodies. It's often seen as a yellow stain on the mortared walls of older buildings. And finally, we have Caloplaca subsoluta, which is found more on naturally occurring rocks rather than concrete. So these are the 6 most diverse groups in the area. There are also a few other common lichens that are not in these groups, but I will skip those over for now because you have probably had enough. Rather, we'll turn our attention to a few rare lichens, including a couple of things that are the first reports for North America and a couple of species that are new to science. So this lichen is Agonimia repleta, which is part of a small group that's not that well understood in North America. Most members of Agonimia like to live tucked away in a clump of moss, and so they're easily overlooked and are often collected by accident. This one, however, was found in the open growing on a slab of shale in the Wikechokie Creek corridor in Hunterdon County. This is a crustose lichen. You can see the flat green thallus here that is punctuated by these round black fruiting bodies. The real distinction, though, is when you turn on the microscope to look at the spores that come out of the fruiting bodies, you can see that some of them have a crescent or half moon shape. And this is characteristic of Agonimia repleta as it has been found in Europe. And so this is the first time that it has been found in North America, right here in the Delaware Valley. Before we move on to the next new record for North America, we will pause for a bit of doggerel from our ancient friend Jonathan Swift, written in 1733. The vermin only tease and pinch their foes superior by an inch. So naturalists observe a flea hath smaller fleas that on him prey, and these have smaller still to bite him, and so proceed ad infinitum. I use this to introduce you to the idea that lichens, which are themselves fungi, have other fungi as parasites. These are called lichenicolous fungi, and lichenologists study them too, in part because most of them are quite particular about which lichen they will attack. For example, this lichen is in the Rhinodina group, which is very common on rocks in our area. You can see the black fruiting bodies and the light-colored rims. However, when it is attacked by this parasite, the fruiting bodies turn reddish brown and the rims almost disappear. So this parasite is a fungus called Tremella rhinodini, and it only attacks lichens in the Rhinodina group. This is the distribution map in a recent treatment of the Tremella group for Tremella rhinodini. You can see most reports coming from Northwest Europe, with this one red dot over here in Hunterdon County. So when they talk about the distribution, they say Europe, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, and North America, USA, New Jersey. So those are a couple of things that were first recorded from North America from our region. And now a couple of species new to science that were found here. Here is our description of Catillaria patiana, which was found growing on a diabase boulder on Mount Rose in Mercer County. It has both fruiting bodies, which you can see here in these photographs. It's got the fruiting bodies as well as asexual granules, which you can kind of make out maybe here and over here, that it can also use to reproduce. The fact that it has both is what makes it distinctive in this group. And I had the privilege of naming this for my PhD advisor, Howard Pattee. And here we have a new lichenicolous fungus, Tremella conidio-punctilia. So this is in the same Tremella group as the one we saw a minute ago. This was described based on material collected in Hunterdon County at Crystal Springs Preserve. It infects a common foliose lichen in the punctilia group and creates these black zones of infection on its targets. So a couple of things new to North America, a couple of things new to science, all of which I think goes to demonstrate that in the that even in an area that we consider to be fairly disturbed habitat and lots of population density, you can still find a lot of new and interesting lichens. So I'll wrap this up with some recommendations for those who would like to learn more about lichens. This book, Urban Lichens by Jessica Allen and James Lendemer, is the best starting point for most folks, and it's probably also an ending point for most. It reviews more than 60 of the most common lichens to be found in our area with good descriptions and pictures. It's centered on New York City, but the reality is that for the most part, their lichens are our lichens. If you'd like to know even more, these are a couple of regional guides that are also useful in our area. Delmarva Lichens by Lendemer and Noel is quite useful for the coastal plain. The Lichens of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, believe it or not, by Tripp and Lendemer, is also good for the Piedmont and Highlands areas. And if you want a continental view, you can get Lichens of North America by Brodo, Sharnoff, and Sharnoff, which is a beautiful coffee table-sized book with detailed descriptions and photos of more than 800 species from sea to shining sea. The accompanying key will help you identify more than 2,000 species, which is about a third of the known species in North America. And if you really want to go all in, the Eagle Hill Institute in Maine is the only place on the East Coast that regularly offers week-long introductory courses on lichens. Troy McMullen of the Canadian Museum of Nature teaches this one, and he is quite good. So with that, I'm going to close with some thank yous. First, thank you to all of the custodians of preserved open space in the Delaware Valley who made it possible for us to study lichen biodiversity on their properties. And second, thank you for institutional support to the New York Botanical Garden and the New York State Museum for curating and housing our Delaware Valley specimens, to the Chrysler Herbarium and Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers for providing lab space and expertise, and to the Philadelphia Botanical Club for a member grant that has funded our molecular data work. So at this point, I think if people have questions about lichens, and there are certainly lots of things about lichens that I did not get to, why don't you jump in and ask? Cindy will quarterback this for us.
Yes, wonderful. Lots of great information. It's amazing how closely you look at them and how beautiful they really are,
Oh,
the
yes,
textures and colors. Uh, Lots of good information. Thank you very much.
sure.
So, questions are coming in. Are the lichen that are found mostly in Europe invasive to this area?
Um, Generally speaking, no. There are a couple of lichens. I mean, lichens grow very slowly, so they're not going to be invasive in the same way that Japanese stilt grass is invasive, for example. So there are some lichens that seem to be moving out of their traditional range, um, but they are species that would have been found here to begin with. There's in many cases it's not really clear whether the lichens that are from Europe, quote unquote, are the same lichens that we have here. What happened through much of the early history of lichenology in the 19th century and well into the 20th century is that there were no lichen experts in North America. So when they found a lichen, they would send it to a colleague in Europe, and the Europeans would say, "Oh, well, this is one of these," and send it back. So there are a lot of North American lichens that have European names, but it's not 100% sure in all of those cases that they are actually the same species. There's a lot more work that needs to be done on that. But in terms of invasiveness, I think lichens can be slightly invasive if they can find a suitable habitat, but they grow so slowly, it's hard to imagine them doing the kinds of things that other invasives do. One thing that I would say is that we do see some lichens moving around on nursery stock. So if you see this a lot in parking lots where saplings will be brought in to be planted, and they'll have a bunch of lichens on them that are not native to the area. Some of those lichens may in fact survive over some period of time, but most of them will not over a 10 or 20-year period.
Okay, are there any lichens edible?
Um, Depends on how desperate you are. The lichens are generally not eaten by people. In some cases, they can be. Scandinavian cuisine has some recipes. South Asian cuisine has some recipes that would include lichens. The only mammals that routinely eat a lot of lichen are reindeer, because in the winter the lichen is the only thing that's available for them to eat, so they're able to paw through the snow and eat some lichen, which really covers much of the land surface in the north of the Arctic Circle. The reindeer don't thrive on the lichen, but it does manage to get them through the winter until they can get better stuff in the spring.
Great. What are the advantages of lichens or disadvantages?
Well, lichens, like all creatures, lichens have a place in the grand scheme of things. Lichens do photosynthesize, so they are taking in carbon dioxide and producing oxygen, and they don't actually. Lichens on trees in particular do not damage the trees. They are growing just on the surface of the trees, and they get all of the nutrients they need directly from the air. Lichens do also over very long periods of time break down rock into soil. So lichens that are growing on rock over the course of perhaps 10,000 years or so can reduce a boulder to soil. But the main use that we have for lichens is as environmental indicators, and they've proved quite useful for that purpose because of their sensitivity, particularly to air quality.
All right. Since all lichens are composed of at least two different organisms, does one find a given fungus or alga with different of the other one?
Well, that's a great question. It's interesting because, as I said before, there are about 20,000 species of fungus that are in a lichenized relationship. Now, there are not 20,000 species of algae that pair up with them. There's actually maybe only a couple hundred, and they're mostly from a small number of genera. So the algae, let's say, are quite promiscuous in that they will pair up with a lot of different types of fungi, but most of the fungi will pair up with only one type of alga. Um, and this makes it a little tricky to reproduce because the fungus produces spores, and then it has to send its spores out into the world and hope that they get lucky by landing somewhere near an alga that they can pair up with. Um, there are methods that they have found to reproduce asexually as well. We can talk about that a little more if you like. But the main thing is that there are lots and lots and lots. All the diversity, let's say, all the diversity is in the fungus, and the name of the lichen, the scientific name of the lichen, is the name of the fungus and not of the algae.
Okay, I love this talk. Thanks. Can you say how long it takes for lichens to grow?
Depends on the lichen. Some lichens grow very, very slowly. Perhaps no more than an eighth of an inch in diameter in a year. There are lichens that are known to be thousands of years old that have been growing particularly on rock surfaces in some areas, like in lichens are able to live. I mean, here I've been spending a lot of time talking about how sensitive they are and how, a little bad air will sort of knock them for a loop. But their lichens in some cases are quite hardy and able to tolerate environments that lots of other creatures cannot. So if you go up a mountain, as you get near the top, you're above the tree line, all the vascular plants have fallen away, you're still going to have lichens. You move toward the North or South Pole, the same thing happens. You're going to find lichens there in some very difficult habitats. There is a field of study called lichenometry, in which lichens are actually used to measure the age of certain things. By looking at their diameters. There's some studies that have been done, for example, to measure the recession of glaciers. So if you imagine a glacier that's got a bunch of rocks underneath the glacier, and of course those rocks have not seen the sun for millions of years. And as those glaciers recede and those rocks become exposed, they become surfaces on which lichens can grow. So a rock may have a lichen growing on it, and you can go back and measure that lichen. And because the growth rate of the lichen, which is known not for all lichens, but for a few lichens, you can measure the growth rate, and you can determine how long ago it was that the glacier melted at that point.
Okay, why do they say lichen are not harmful to trees, but soon after they cover a limb, it becomes spongy and then breaks off the trunk? Is that not damaging?
Um, that's a question that I hear with some regularity, and there's actually the causation there is backwards. Lichens need light to photosynthesize, and a tree that is not healthy or a limb that is not healthy is not going to leaf out as much. And if they don't have a lot of healthy leaves, then more light is going to get to the surface of either the branch or the trunk of the tree, and that will allow more lichens to grow there. So the lichens are not damaging the tree. The lichens are actually an indicator, again, a kind of indicator that that particular tree or that particular part of the tree is not healthy.
How do lichens spread and what are fruiting bodies?
Well, the fruiting bodies are the part of the fungus that produces the spores, which are the sexual propagules that they use to reproduce, just like mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of mushrooms. Uh, so uh, so this is where the spores are produced, and the spores are shot out into the environment. Hopefully, they will find some place to land that's going to be conducive to starting a new lichen there. Um, Lichens also, in some cases, are able to reproduce asexually by creating small. You can think of them as sort of little care packages with a bit of fungus and a bit of alga, and they send these either particles, um, mostly particles of one kind or another, out into the world. They can be washed away by water, wind, carried off by insects, that kind of thing, to establish a new lichen. And then they have both components right there. They have the green part and the fungal part.
Are any lichens medicinal?
Um, there are some cultures that have used lichens for medicinal purposes. Um, some of the reindeer moss has been used as a way of uh, stopping bleeding and cuts. Um, and various teas and tinctures and that kind of thing have also been made out of lichens that are thought to have medicinal properties. Lichens are interesting in that there are a lot of chemicals that they produce. I mean, if you think about when you think about what it must be like to be a lichen, I mean, you're sort of splatted up against the side of some surface. You can't move. You're completely exposed. How do you keep from getting predated? How do you keep things from eating you? One way is to make yourself unpalatable, and the way you do that is by producing chemicals. And many lichens are little chemical factories, and the number of different kinds of unusual chemicals that they produce, I think there's something like 1,000. They're called them secondary metabolites that lichen produce that are not really found anywhere else in nature. So there is research ongoing with some of these actually in the pharmaceutical industry to see if there's any potential medicinal use for some of these lichen compounds. Haven't found any yet, but they're still working on it.
Are there fossilized lichens?
Yes, lichens don't fossilize that well. There are some what are thought to be fossilized lichens that are several hundred million years old. Um, but there aren't a lot of them, and there are certainly not enough to allow us to sort of establish a family history of lichens. There are lichens that have been preserved in amber. But those are not as old. Those go back only maybe 80 to 100 million years or so. Um, like the mosquitoes from Jurassic Park and so forth. The amber encloses the lichen. So there's quite a number of those have been discovered. But as for older fossils, not so many.
Do lichens help fertilize plants and trees?
Um, Not to my knowledge. You know, there are fungi that are involved that have a symbiotic like relationship with tree roots, but those are not lichenized. That's a different kind of a symbiosis, the
Okay, so
mycorrhizal fungi.
okay, so this listener said lichen is attached to my brick. Therefore, based on your last answer of them capable of breaking rock, can they break down the brick? What about having them all over gravestones? Thank you for your lecture.
Um, the gravestones question is interesting. I mean, if you've got lichens on your brick, you would have to wait a very long time for the lichen to do any damage to your brick. The gravestone question is interesting in that lichens are often cleaned off of gravestones in order to keep them legible. Um, and over a period of 100 or a couple hundred years of a very old gravestone, the lichen can in fact damage the surface a little bit. There's actually a scientist at the University of Wisconsin, Annie Pringle, who studies lichens on gravestones, and who uses that to study the growth of lichens. So she can locate a particular lichen on a particular gravestone that's been there for 10 or 15 years, and every year she goes back and looks at it and studies it to see how it's grown and how it's competing with the other lichens that may be there.
Have lichen evolved to grow underwater?
Um, I think there are one or two species that actually do live underwater. There are certainly some that are quite capable of living sort of semi-immersed.
I can see fungi benefiting from the photosynthesis of algae, but how do the algae benefit, or is it not really symbiotic?
Cindy, Dennis is on mute right now by accident when he adjusted his headset.
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. Yeah, the lichens, uh, presumably the fungus provides some protection to the algae. In other words, particularly against ultraviolet radiation. So the lichen fungus, the fungal component, provides a nurturing environment. You could almost think of it as a kind of agriculture, in that the fungus is cultivating a crop, but it's cultivating inside itself rather than cultivating it out on a field somewhere.
How many of the species in the Recovery NYC lichen in 2017 are the same species from 1823?
I don't know the answer to that. There is a study coming out on that, I think, in the not too distant future, that I think may answer that question, but I don't have that off the top of my head. I would suspect that many of them are comparable, but it's probably not 100% overlap.
Are there new lichens being invented as we speak?
Um, well, inventing meaning new species of lichens being created as an evolutionary through evolution. Um, it is interesting in that lichens kind of come and go. The lichenized condition, as I said earlier, you can think of it as a lifestyle, and certain groups of fungi can adopt that lifestyle and then can let it go. So there are some fungi that were once lichenized that are now free living, and there are probably some fungi that are now free living that will become lichenized and may in fact be in the process of becoming lichenized right now. But it's a long, slow process over evolutionary time, so it's very difficult to tell exactly what's going on at this moment.
Regarding lichen on gravestones, is there any way to date how old a particular lichen is?
There are certain lichens for which the growth rate is been pretty well documented. Again, this field of lichenometry, which you can look up on the internet. But there are some of the ones that we talked about that are extremely adapted to disturbed habitats and bad air, can actually grow pretty quickly. So you can have a lichen that'll grow into a substantial lichen within a matter of a few years. But on gravestones, the ones that they're studying are the ones for which the growth rate is well documented.
When we do biological surveys, are there particular species that we should look for as indicators of environmental quality? And in parentheses, DNR greenway properties.
The answer is yes. The U.S. Forest Service has actually been doing lichen-based research of this kind for many years. So they have certain lichen species that they use as indicators, and they have actual study sites, particularly in the Intermountain West, although they have done some work in the East as well. And I believe they have a publication that may be available online. I don't know the details, but if you look at the U.S. Forest Service website and look at you can look up their lichen program, and that would give you some indication. There are a few groups. There's a group of fruticose lichens called usneas that are quite pollution sensitive, and so that would be a good indicator species, certain or indicator group, certainly in our area.
Okay, how dissimilar do the genomes of a particular specimen have to be to qualify as novel species, given that habitat is constrained such that normal locational separation is not a criterion?
Um, well, the how species are determined in lichenology remains something of a mystery to me. There are uh, the advent of molecular work, I think, is going to help sort this out. But there are not that many lichenologists, and there is not that much budget for doing too much of that. So some of it is being done. We're doing some, there are labs around the world that are doing bits of it, but it doesn't have nearly the institutional support that vascular plants do, for example. But the how species are determined in lichenology seems somewhat arbitrary to me as someone who's come into the field, only 10 or 15 years ago, and I still can't say that I fully understand it. In some groups, the presence or absence of a single chemical will allow you to delineate two species, which I think I mentioned when I was talking about those physias earlier. But there'll be other situations in which having the presence or absence of a chemical will not be an indicator that it's a species. It might be a subspecies or just a chemical variety. So it's still I find it complex and somewhat frustrating myself.
Slow growing as they may be, are there any lichens which grow specifically on bones or dead insects?
I don't know. I don't think dead insects. Uh, bones. There. I don't know if there are any that grow specifically on bones. There certainly are lichens that do grow on bones. In our area, probably the most specific thing that might be like a bone, there is a lichen that grows only on the shells of barnacles. So if you can visualize a barnacle, and you can think that in the barnacle shell there are some tiny pits, and in the pits there is a lichen living. So you have to use your imagination for that. But that is one case in which you've got a lichen that is quite specifically growing on something that is bone-like, I guess. And I guess, well, um, they are barnacles are arthropods, so they're sort of insect-like.
So Don noted there's a good PDF, Pinelands Lichen Ecology by Natalie Howe.
Yes. Natalie Howe is a PhD student, one of the other fine lichenologists in New Jersey. There's a few of us, although she's living in Washington now. But yes, she did a study of did a lichen study of the New Jersey pine barrens for her PhD thesis at Rutgers. I'm going to say that was 10-ish years ago.
So classification is based on the fungus.
Yes. The fungus. The name of the lichen is the name of the fungus. That's where the diversity is.
Fair enough. So any other questions? All right. Having not seeing any new questions, I want to say thank you everyone for attending, and thank you Dennis Waters for presenting. Very interesting.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for everyone for showing up tonight.
Take care. Good night.
Good night.